Hello again, and welcome to the Gospel of Mark. I'm Jim Grant, your host, and it's been a pleasure for 19 weeks to be breaking open this fantastic Gospel. My two guests every week have been Father Mike Lastiri, who is the Director of Worship for the Diocese of Fresno and pastor of Immaculate Heart of Mary Parish in Hanford, and our scholar expert, Dr. Robert Maldonado from California State University, Fresno, from the Philosophy Department. We're so glad to have Robert and Father Mike each week cracking open the depths of that first Christian gospel. Robert, you asked for a favor and you don't ask for much. You'd like a chance to one more time explain the depth of the importance of the triple, and you're not talking about Rajan Rondo. So tell us what Mark does with his triple that we just finished now the third time.
Well, one of the things that's important to remember, we started this show back half a year ago or whatever, and one of the things we emphasized was narrative criticism, and one of the things I've been trying to do is to sort of look at Mark as a story and look at the whole story instead of just the more typical way of the little pieces independent of each other. And we're just moving now into the Passion narrative with this episode in chapter 11, and so it's a good moment to sort of look back just a moment and see how Mark has brought us to this moment as a whole story. And of course, one of the things that Mark does is this second half structure where has three predictions of the Passion, followed by the three negative reactions by the disciples, followed by positive teaching on this servant, slave, child, anti-patriarchy, anti-hierarchy following of Jesus. And the other thing that Mark does with this threefold structure that happens three times, the triple, he frames this triple with two blind man miracle stories. He introduces it with the blind man at Bethsaida, which was that kind of odd miracle story of the two-stage healing. And then with Bartimaeus, has Bartimaeus be symbolic of the true Markan disciple, the true follower who gets Jesus. Unlike the named disciples, he gets Jesus and follows him on the cross, to the way on the cross. And so it's good, I think, just to take a moment and go back to the blind man at Bethsaida with this two-stage miracle, because Mark, I think, is also making the blind man at Bethsaida symbolic of us, of the reader, hearer of the gospel. Because remember, kind of like the disciples, Mark leads us through the gospels where we see Jesus is the Christ at the confession in chapter 8, but we don't see quite clearly, kind of like the man who is blind. And so Mark continues to lead us through this suffering servant, anti-hierarchy Jesus Christ, who is fully revealed on the cross. And so we, in the gospel narrative, have an experience just like the blind man at Bethsaida. We see that he is the Christ, but we don't see quite clearly. Peter never gets past that stage, but then, like Bartimaeus, we should hopefully see what the conditions of following Jesus are.
What I really want to thank you, Robert, is that we're not looking at this gospel as academics. All this scholarship is only helping us read the gospel as it's directed to us today. In other words, with some really good insight to figure out what's the depth of the message. Not the little subtleties of some Greek words here and there, but rather the whole story. How is it challenging us as Christian believers today? And thank you, Robert, for reminding us that Mark was doing that same thing with that Christian community, persecuted community in Rome that did not grasp whom they were following, why they were following, and why this was the challenge that we face today. It's the same one faced by the Christians so long ago. Could we look now maybe at chapter 11 in its entirety? Greg, can you put up the way the chapter unfolds? And Father Mike, can you show us the little progression that it looks like Mark's leading us on?
Well, first of all, we are entering into that moment, of course, towards the end of his time, but there's some interesting things that are going on. Obviously, the days in Jerusalem, as Jerusalem is getting very busy with pilgrims coming from all over, getting ready for Passover, the entrance into Jerusalem, Jesus in the temple, Again, that principal place where Jews gathered to worship, and then the cursing of the fig tree. We'll probably talk a little bit about that, and a little interesting story in the meantime. The cleansing of the temple. Again, how does this enter into, again, the temple filled with people, but also filled with merchants? But what does that symbolize for Mark? The meaning, again, back to the fig tree. And then, of course, the question of authority. We've talked about authority and how Jesus sees authority. And once again, we'll deal with that.
What we're going to do right now is probably not read this story of the entrance into Jerusalem, but it is that reading that we always do on Palm Sunday, Passion Sunday. It's that short reading we read. I wonder if Robert has one thought about what would be the main thing that we may miss. Let's pick out the things we're going to miss if we're not careful. Robert, what's something about 1 to 10 that we're going to miss?
Well, it's a little, as you said last week. Again, the disciples are sent on a mission, and they seem to succeed a little bit. But again, the mission is ultimately to the cross. And again, they have made a mistake of thinking that this sort of power and privilege is what they're going to get. And so there's irony here, right? The royal entrance into the city is not the kind of royalty that's for the few. It's kind of like the slave of all. If everybody's slave, nobody's master. If everybody's king, nobody is underling. And the disciples seem to want a Messiah who is the king that's not everybody.
Anything else, Father Mike, on that first 10 verses that you think we need to know?
Having been there recently, the whole idea of Mount of Olives, when you're standing at the Mount of Olives, there is that valley, if you will. It's the valley of death. It comes from out of the Good Shepherd, Psalm 23rd, because to get from the Mount of Olives, you have to go through what are graves, were then and still are today, and then you come up to the city of Jerusalem. You have a climb. And the village is on the outskirts of the city. So that means, again, it's another way, it's a journey, but it's also this kind of looking forward to something else in another place before you even get into the royal city. And so there's this continual journey that these people have to go through, and therefore Jesus seems to, there's been some preparation, but it's the whole idea. Jesus has been preparing them for a long time, not only for this moment, but he's been trying to tell them for the past, all of this is going to come and what they're going to be doing.
Now, the next thing that we are going to read, though, because it's so sort of like deserves something of detail, would be the little reading on the cursing of the fig tree, verses 12 to 14 in chapter 11. Robert, you want to give that a little read?
On the following day, when they came from Bethany, he was hungry. And seeing in the distance a fig tree in leaf, he went to see if he could find anything on it. When he came to it, he found nothing but leaves, for it was not the season for figs. And he said to it, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." And his disciples heard it.
Well, that's a little passage that we're going to let Father Mike make a stab at first. Jesus is Palestinian. He knows that in April you're going to get leaves. That's great. For Passover, you'll see leaves. But only in June will you get the figs. So this is already only the spring. Father Mike, what's going on? Is Jesus forgetting how things grow or what?
I don't think Jesus forget anything. He was hungry. And because he was hungry, he wanted a fig, and it wasn't one there. Cursing might be, even, if you will, to be a very human thing, to look at something and says, darn it, it's, don't have it, whatever the case may be. It's just, it again is this Mark's way of conveying a deeper meaning of the power of Jesus, that he has power even over nature, over things, not only that of people, but things that may bother him. Is this a human story? Is it all of those kinds of things? It's hard to put so much into it because it really is not quite sure, unless he simply was hungry.
I think the hungry part is good because he's got a sandwich here. And we're going to see that what Father Mike read was the first piece of bread. That was setting up the sandwich. And in the inside of the sandwich, Robert, tell us what's going on with the cleansing of the temple, because the other piece of bread that's going to close the deal is the meaning of the withering fig tree. So, Robert, the meat of the material would be the cleansing of the temple. What's going on here?
The sandwich really does set up something. I mean, the focus is clearly on the temple, and the connection of the fig tree to the temple is hard not to think that there's something going on there. But it's still a very puzzling episode. The cleansing of the temple certainly functions to set up, if you will, the final clash between Jesus and the religious authorities in Jerusalem. And so in the sense of the narrative, the story, it's the thing that kind of gets the final plot of Jesus' death going. But it's also interesting, too, to just remember the historical context, because the temple was huge. It was so big, and I always grew up thinking about this episode as, Jesus just stops everything because of his activity. And what probably would have been the case is 90+% of the people at the temple wouldn't have even noticed this happened. And that's just an interesting thing to think about, how our imaginations can construct one thing and the sort of physical circumstances another. It's back on the fig tree, too. It's kind of interesting to think, he was hungry, as Father Mike emphasized. And if we go back all the way to the earliest sort of reference to royalty, the plucking grain on the Sabbath back in chapter 2, the disciples are commended and the Pharisees are rebuked with the story about King David, who was able to satisfy his needs by eating the bread in the temple, which was not lawful to eat. And so perhaps that's a connection, is that the cursing of the fig tree is the kingdom of God, the reign of God, is for the satisfaction of human needs and the Spirit. And when it's not, those institutions, those things that do not provide are not worth a place.
Now, whenever Mark gives us a sandwich, and this isn't the first, it's actually, we've seen a little litany of these things. They're telling us we have to take a break, but we're not going to take the break yet till we at least get through the sandwich, okay? Then we'll come back. Now, let's look at that follow-up to what Robert just said, which is the meaning of the withered fig tree. And I'm wondering if the meaning of the withering fig tree sheds light, as it usually should, to the meat. So what do we have here? Father Mike, the meaning of the withered fig tree, what is going on in that little passage that's the final part of our first half of the program today?
Well, if you notice in the text, it says, the tree that you have cursed has withered, and then he follows it, have faith in God. The thing is, things do wither, things do whatever, but have faith. Jesus continually throughout Mark reminds people the need of faith. That whole deeper spiritual meaning, if you will, of discipleship, because without faith, the discipleship doesn't. It's also faith that allowed the woman who had the hemorrhage to be healed. It allowed the man to ask for his daughter to be raised. It's that constant, if you will, handing over, looking beyond, that whatever you see before you can change and will change. And the withered fig represents so many things that have withered. And even as he's with his disciples, whose faith is still weak, it's still growing, it's still a bit nebulous, they're probably a part of that withered fig at times, and certainly that whole structure around him.
Robert, before we take the break, final thought connecting our temple cleansing and the cursing of the fig tree. They go together a little bit here.
Well, I like the point about the fig and faith, and also have faith. It could be have faith of God. I mean, so as a kind of objective genitive there, and also so the kind of faith that God has is what we're supposed to have, and then you get whatever you ask in prayer, but then that's immediately linked to forgiveness. And so it's not just a sort of gospel of prosperity again. It's a cost of discipleship.
Just a final thought. He doesn't give us, Mark, doesn't give us the Lord's Prayer, but he gives us the heart of it. I mean, he gives us this little last line, and maybe we could show the picture of the Amish women who represent forgiveness. Here's what he says at the end. And whenever you stand praying, forgive if you have anything against anyone, so that your Father also who is in heaven may forgive you your trespasses. Shortened Lord's Prayer, hitting on the main theme of forgiveness. If you want forgiveness, forgive. On that note, we take our break. We'll be back in 1 minute, so please don't go far because we've got a lot to do in the next half of the show.
KNXT thanks all its loyal viewers and respected businesses who have supported your Catholic television station. Now you can support KNXT with program underwriting by having your name, your company's name, or organization associated with your favorite program. Detailed information about you or your company will appear before and after each program or day part you select. Keep the quality and spiritual message alive and make a difference. Call 559-488-7440 today or go online at knxt.tv to find out more about program underwriting on KNXT.
Hello again, and welcome to the second part of our program today. We're finishing off on chapter 11. We're sort of like at a very important part. We have two things to share in this section, the question on authority, and then that parable of the wicked tenants, one of the very few parables in Mark, and it's allegorical, supremely allegorical, meaning watch out, don't misinterpret it. And why don't we look at that question of authority a little bit. Robert, what do we have here on that segment 23 to 33 in chapter 11?
Well, in this section, again, it's the authorities come to Jesus and want to know, the religious authorities come to Jesus, they want to know what Jesus' authority is, and Jesus sort of turns it back on them and asks about the preaching of John the Baptist, and the religious authorities are sort of silenced, caught in not being able to answer well Jesus' question, and so Jesus refuses to answer their question about his own authority. And so partly this is setting up the tension between the religious authorities and Jesus that, of course, is going to culminate in his execution by Rome. But it's also, for the reader, a chance to sort of try to reflect on, well, what is the authority? And again, it's linked to the faith that's just been discussed with the faith in God, or the faith of God that the followers are supposed to have.
I have a question here, and it's worth 10 points. It's to either one of you. I'm not sure who wants it. By what authority are you doing these things, or who gave you this authority to do them? Is it meaning the most recent things, these things that we just saw, meaning the entry into Jerusalem, like by what authority are you entering in on a big colt, and the temple action? Or is it meaning all these things of you guy, your teachings, your healings? What do you think? What are these things that they're wondering about the authority about it?
Well, I certainly would think that it's, again, throughout the story, there is that constant doubting, debating, rebuking, all of that, and it comes to a point is they're exasperated, if you will, and says, why are you doing all this? Where does this come from? How can you? And again, what authority do you have?
And then the next story that we're going to read now is not, again, off point, or why does it fit in here? Did he just throw it in here by some random chance? Not at all. Father Mike.
And he began to speak to them in parables. A man planted a vineyard and set a hedge around it and dug a pit for a wine press and built a tower and let it out to tenants and went into another country. When the time came, he sent a servant to the tenants to get from them some of the fruit of the vineyard, and they took him and beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Again, he sent to them another servant, and they wounded him in the head and treated him shamefully. And he sent another, and they him they killed, and so with many others. Some they beat, some they killed. He had still one other, a beloved son. Finally, he sent him to them, saying, They will respect my son. But those tenants said to one another, This is the heir. Come, let us kill him, and the inheritance will be ours. And they took him and killed him, and cast him out of the vineyard. What will the owner of the vineyard do? You will come and destroy the tenants, and give the vineyard to others. Have you not read the scripture? The very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. This was the Lord's doing, and it is marvelous in our eyes. And they tried to arrest him, but feared the multitude, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. So they left him and went away.
Awesome. Robert, again, there's so much to open up here. What are some of the first things, leaving some things for Father Mike to still play with?
Well, there's always kind of two issues with parables. One is how much of them actually go back to the words of Jesus in his historical moment, and how much of them are sort of symbolic reflections, sermons from the early church, which would be sort of after the fact or after quite a bit of time. And so it's certainly easy to see this as a kind of commentary on the non-acceptance of Jesus. But I'd like to sort of try to put it back before the actual destruction of the temple and the later split between Judaism and Christianity in the late first century, and put it back earlier into Mark's time and maybe even back to Jesus, because it still fits with sort of what's going on with the chief priests and the scribes, the Sadducees who were in charge of the temple establishment in Jerusalem. They were in an impossible situation, because ever since Rome came in, Rome took it upon themselves to appoint and depose high priests and pretty much mess with the sort of religious practices in Jerusalem. And so for the leadership, that puts them in an impossible situation, because if they want to serve the people, they almost, by the circumstances, have to collaborate with Rome. They have to compromise, and of course they were not well liked by a lot of the people for those reasons. And so they are kind of collaborating with Rome, and so it's actually possible to read this as a kind of Roman parable. The tenant who's building there and putting the hedge is Rome. Their administration keeps getting messed with by revolution and other problems that are in the circumstance, and by the collaboration of the institutions of privilege and power in Jerusalem. And then Rome's going to finally come in, as Rome is famous for doing in Carthage and Corinth and elsewhere throughout the empire, is going to come in, and all this sort of glass house, this card house that you've built of trying to maintain everything by collaborating with imperial power is going to be swept away.
Father Mike, there's still a lot in this parable that Robert didn't get into detail. What would you like to add about something else that viewers don't want to miss or misinterpret?
Well,
this could be easily manipulated badly.
And it is, and I think, as Robert puts it well, I think it depends on where you want to put it. And of course, scholars put it all over the place. I think one of the important things is, what is the vineyard, and who is the vineyard? Yeah. Who does it belong to? And in and of itself, it's not destroyed. It is a place. It is, if you will, whether it's allegorical, whether it's metaphorical, but it's a place, an important place, and therefore it's worth, it has value to the tenants, it has value to the owner, and obviously people are willing to die for it, because these people who come to bring messages and so on die. And so I think the vineyard is an important place, and it could be that safe place, it could be that part of the kingdom, it could be the reign of God. Whether the leadership is of Jerusalem, the leadership of Rome, wherever it is, people who are, if you will, trampling through all of that creates a problem. And so maybe that is a sacred place for Jesus, even as a parable.
I want to add one little thing that is from Father Harrington, his beautiful book on Sacra Pagina. He's got this thing where he says, this may be this text that I just commented on, he says, could be the Bible in miniature or Mark's Gospel in miniature. So if he's right, wow, what is he meaning? And one thing he did say in another paragraph, I am totally against supersessionism, which would mean that the church would be misunderstood as replacing Israel as the people of God. Because as Father Mike just said, the vineyard is not destroyed. It's the tenants. It's the manipulators. It's the ones on top, the tenant farmers, the ones who have despoiled it. They are the establishment, this priesthood, this leadership of the people, but not Israel itself, which is the vineyard. So it's a subtle field we're walking through. And in conclusion, I'll give you both a chance. Robert, what would be something in conclusion that you do want our viewers not to overstretch and misinterpret, but you'd want to repeat something else you've shared before maybe?
Well, I think it's important to also point out that quoting the scripture, the very stone which the builders rejected has become the head of the corner. Traditionally and probably rightly, that's applied to Jesus, but it's also a building. And of course, if we put that back in the context of Mark, Mark is building a new house, right? Jesus is building a new house of the new followers, and the crowd is the positive character mostly in Mark, and not the few.
Father Mike.
And again, towards the end of the story, they wanted to arrest him. Fear. And what fear does. Fear tries to silence. It tends to do a lot of things when prophetic voice is heard. And I think Mark challenged. Whether or not it was the Romans or the Jewish leadership, whatever, what he said bothered. And so they wanted to take some kind of action to stop him and silence him. But his actions wouldn't allow him.
You know, we've come to the end of this program today. One line is very, very interesting, and I think it's almost in a nutshell what we've been talking about. And they tried to arrest him, but feared the multitude, for they perceived that he had told the parable against them. The multitude, as Robert has pointed out often, this crowd, they're good. The them is the religious leaders who know where the fingers are being pointed. What's very important, I think, for us is to know that as we read this gospel, we also find it pointed to us. So we'll interpret it for ourselves. Till next week, God bless.